One of the 28th, by G.A. Henty. Preface. Although in the present story a boy plays the principal part and encounters many adventures by land and sea, a woman is the real heroine, and the part she played demanded an amount of nerve and courage fully equal to that necessary for those who take part in active warfare. Boys are rather apt to think, mistakenly, that their sex has a monopoly of courage, but I believe that in moments of great peril women are to the full as brave and as collected as men. Indeed, my own somewhat extensive experience leads me to go even further, and to assert that among a civil population untrained to arms, the average woman is cooler and more courageous than the average man. Women are nervous about little matters. They may be frightened at a mouse or at a spider, but in the presence of real danger, when shells are bursting in the streets and rifle bullets flying thickly, I have seen them standing knitting at their doors and talking to their friends across the street, when not a single man was to be seen. There is no greater mistake than to think women cowards because they are sometimes nervous over trifles. Were it necessary, innumerable cases could be quoted from history to prove that women can, upon occasion, fight as courageously as men. Caesar found that the women of the German tribes could fight bravely side by side with the men, and the Amazons of the King of Dahomey are more feared by the neighboring tribes than are his male soldiers. Almost every siege has its female heroines, and in the Dutch War of Independence the female companies of Sluis and Haarlem proved themselves a match for the best soldiers of Spain. Above all, in patient endurance of pain and suffering, women are immeasurably superior to men. I emphasize this point because I know that many boys, simply because they are stronger than girls, are apt to regard them with a sort of contempt, and to fancy themselves, without the least justification, not only stronger but braver and more courageous, in fact superior beings in every way. Signed, G.A. Henty. Chapter 1. Unexpected News. I have written to ask Ralph Conway to come and stay for a time with me. The announcement was a simple one, but it fell like a bombshell in the midst of the party at breakfast at Penfold Hall. The party consisted only of the speaker, Herbert Penfold, and his two sisters. The latter both exclaimed, "Herbert!" in a tone of shocked surprise. Mr. Penfold was evidently prepared for disapprobation. He had spoken in a somewhat nervous tone, but with a decision quite unusual to him. He had finished his last piece of toast and emptied his last cup of tea before making the announcement, and he now pushed back his chair, rose to his feet, and said, "Yes, I have been thinking of having him here for some time, and I suppose that as master of this house I am at liberty to ask whom I like. At any rate, I would rather have no discussion on the subject." So saying, without giving his sisters time to reply, he walked hastily to the door and went out. Miss Penfold and Miss Eleanor Penfold gazed at each other in speechless astonishment. So accustomed were they to settle everything that took place at Penfold Hall that this sudden assumption of authority on the part of their brother fairly staggered them. Miss Penfold was the first to speak. "This is terrible, Eleanor. To think that after all these years Herbert's thoughts should still be turning toward that woman. But it is only what might be expected. The ingratitude of men is terrible. Here we have for the last 20 years been devoting our lives to him, not only keeping his house for him, but seeing that he did not fall a victim to any of the designing women who would have insinuated themselves into his good graces, and prevented him from indulging in all sorts of foolish tastes, and bringing himself to ruin. And now, you see, he turns again to that artful woman, and without saying a word to us, invites her son to come here. It is monstrous, sister." "It is monstrous," Miss Eleanor Penfold repeated, with tears in her eyes. "It is like flying in the face of Providence, sister." "It is flying in our faces," Miss Penfold replied sharply. "And just at the present moment that is of more importance. To think that man must have been brooding over this and making up his mind to act in this way for weeks, perhaps, and never to say a word to us upon the subject. I wonder he didn't ask the woman herself down." "He never could have done such a shameless thing, Charlotte," her sister said, much shocked. "Of course, we must have left the house instantly." "Oh, I should not have left the house," Miss Penfold said firmly. "If the woman comes, and now he has asked the boy, it's quite possible that he may ask the mother. Our duty will be to remain here. You know we have been uneasy ever since her husband died. Herbert's infatuation concerning her has been pitiable, and we have always believed it has been that alone which has caused him to refuse so obstinately to enter into our plans, or to pay even decent courtesy to the various excellent young women we have from time to time asked down here, and who were in every way suitable for the position of mistress of this house, women full of sense, and who with right guidance would have made him perfectly happy. And now he flies in our faces and asks the boy down. I have had an idea for some little time that he has had something on his mind. He's been more nervous and fidgety than usual, and several times he had seemed to be on the point of saying something, and then changed his mind. Of course, one can understand it all now. No wonder he was ashamed to look us in the face when he was meditating such a step as this. The duplicity of man is something shocking. It was not surprising that Herbert Penfold's sudden assertion of his will was a shock to his sisters. These ladies had so long been accustomed to rule absolutely at Penfold Hall that Mr. Penfold's assertion of his right to act as he pleased in his own house came upon them like an act of absolute rebellion. At their father's death they were women of 27 and 26 years respectively. Herbert was a lad of 16. He was of gentle and yielding disposition, and as their father for some years previous to his death had been a confirmed invalid, and they had had the complete management of the house, it was but natural that at the father's death they should continue in the same position. Owing to weak health, Herbert had not been sent to school, but had been educated under the care of a tutor. He had wished when he reached the age of 19 to enter one of the universities, but his sisters had been so opposed to the idea, and had represented so strongly to him his unfitness to take part in the rough sports of the young men, and how completely he would feel out of place in such companionship, that he had abandoned the idea and had travelled on the continent for 3 years with his tutor, his sisters being for most of the time of the party. Soon after his return he had fallen in love with the daughter of Colonel Vernon, an officer living on half pay at Poole, which was the nearest town to Penfold Hall. The announcement of his engagement came like a thunderclap upon his sisters, who had agreed that it would be in all respects better if Herbert should not marry for some years. They had, however, been wise enough not to offer any open opposition to the match. 3 months later the engagement was broken off. How it came about no one exactly knew. Unpleasant reports were set on foot. There were misunderstandings which should easily have been cleared up, but which grew until they gave rise to serious quarrels. Letters which might have set matters straight somehow failed to come to hand, and so at last things went from bad to worse until there was a final quarrel, a return of letters and presents on both sides, and a final breaking off of the engagement. A year later Mary Vernon married Mr. Conway, an architect resident in London. Mr. Penfold had before this become convinced that Mary Vernon had not been to blame in the matter, and that he had in some way or other taken an altogether mistaken view of the subject. He knew by the comments of such friends as were intimate enough to speak, and the coolness of many others, that he was considered to have behaved very badly toward her, and this thought was a most distressing one, for he was deeply attached to Mary, and had he not been convinced that from some reason or other she herself had ceased to care for him, and was anxious to break off the engagement, he would have gone to any length toward healing the breach. When it was too late, he bitterly regretted his own weakness in submitting to the domination of his sisters, and felt a deep though silent resentment against them for the share that he was convinced they had taken in causing the breach between himself and Mary Vernon. But although he resented, he had neither the will nor firmness to free himself from their domination. At times he struggled feebly against it, on 2 or 3 occasions had suddenly gone up to town and thence on to the continent, and had travelled there for weeks. On one of these occasions he had written to them saying that he thought it would be for the happiness of them all if they were to leave Penfold Hall and set up an establishment of their own. But upon his return he found things going on exactly as before, and Miss Penfold had spoken somewhat severely of the silly letter he had written to them, a letter displaying at once such ingratitude and folly that it had been beneath them to notice it. As Herbert Penfold was in a way really fond of his sisters, who spared no effort in making his home comfortable for him, and who allowed him to have his own way in all minor matters, he could not bring himself to repeat when face to face with them the opinion he had expressed in writing, and so things had gone on for years. The Miss Penfolds were really anxious to see their brother married, provided only that it was to a lady who would be, in their estimation, fitted for him, and who would also have a feeling of gratitude toward themselves for their share in installing her as mistress of the Hall. They were quite prepared to abdicate in her favour, and to retire to some pretty house near a pleasant watering place, paying visits once or twice a year to the Hall. The listless life their brother led was a source of grief to them, for they were really attached to him, and believed that they had in every way been working for his happiness. They had no shadow of regret for the part they had played in breaking off his engagement with Mary Vernon. Having once convinced themselves that she was a frivolous girl, quite unsuited for the position of mistress of Penfold Hall, they had regarded it as an absolute duty to protect Herbert from the consequences of what they considered his infatuation. Consequently, for years they were in the habit of inviting for long visits young ladies whom they considered in every way eligible as their successor, and had been much grieved at their want of success, and at the absolute indifference with which Herbert regarded the presence of these young women. When, 4 years after his marriage to Mary Vernon, Mr. Conway had died suddenly, they had been seized with a vague disquiet, for they believed that the remembrance of his first love was the real cause of Herbert's indifference to others, and considered it probable he might still be sufficiently infatuated with her to attempt to undo the past. To their gratification, though, Herbert never alluded to the subject, never, so far as they knew, made the slightest effort to renew her acquaintance. In fact, Herbert Penfold was a diffident as well as a weak man. Once convinced that he had acted badly toward Mary Vernon, he was equally convinced that she must despise him, and that he was utterly unworthy of her. Had it been otherwise, he would have again entered the lists and tried to recover the love he had thrown away. Although he occasionally yielded to the entreaties of his sisters, and showed himself with them at county gatherings, gave stately dinner parties at regular intervals, and accepted the invitations of his neighbours, he lived the life almost of a recluse. His sole companion and friend was the rector of the parish, who had been his tutor during his continental tour, and whom he had presented with the living which was in his gift, to the secret dissatisfaction of his sisters, who had always considered that Herbert's tutor had endeavoured to set him against them. This had to some extent been the case, in so far at least that Mr. Withers, who had left college only a short time before starting with Herbert, had endeavoured to give him habits of self-reliance and independence of thought, and had quietly striven against the influence that his sisters had upon his mind. It was not until after the Mary Vernon episode that the living had fallen vacant. Had it been otherwise, things might have turned out differently, for Herbert would certainly have sought his friend's advice in his troubles. After that it was too late for his interference. Mr. Withers had watched the state of matters at the Hall, and his young wife had often urged him to try to induce Herbert Penfold to rouse himself and assert himself against his sisters, but the vicar remained neutral. He saw that, though at times Herbert was a little impatient at the domination of his sisters, and a chance word showed that he nourished a feeling of resentment toward them, he was actually incapable of nerving himself to the necessary effort required to shake off their influence altogether, and to request them to leave the Hall. Nothing short of this would suffice to establish his independence, for after a mere temporary assertion of authority he would, if they remained there, assuredly speedily allow affairs to lapse into their present state, and the vicar thought that harm rather than good would be caused by his interference, and that as his influence would be sure to be suspected, there would be a breach between the Hall and the rectory. As it was, the connection was an intimate one. Herbert was always glad to see him when he came in for a talk in the course of his rounds, or when he and his wife would come up to dine quietly. The Miss Penfolds were always ready with their purses to aid him to carry out his schemes for the good of the parish, and to sympathize with his young wife in her troubles, for of these she had a large share, all her children save one girl having been carried off in their infancy. Mabel Withers was as much at home at the Hall as at the rectory. She was chief pet and favourite with Mr. Penfold, and although his sisters considered that the rector allowed her to run wild, and that under such license she was growing up a sad tomboy, they could not withstand the influence of the child's happy and fearless disposition, and were, in their way, very kind to her. Such was the state of things at Penfold Hall when its owner's sudden announcement that he invited young Ralph Conway to come to stay there had fallen like a bombshell upon his sisters. The invitation had caused almost as much surprise to Mrs. Conway as to the Miss Penfolds. Her father had died a few months after her marriage, and at the death of her husband she found herself left with an income of about $100 a year, the interest of the sum for which he had insured his life. To her surprise, she had a month or two later received an intimation from the lawyer who managed her business that a friend had arranged to pay the sum of £100 every quarter to her account, on condition only that no inquiry whatever should be made as to his or her identity. Mary Conway had thankfully accepted the gift, which had, however, caused her intense wonderment and curiosity. So far as she knew, neither her father nor her husband had any relations who could have afforded so handsome a gift. She knew that Colonel Vernon had been most popular with his regiment, and the supposition at which she finally arrived was that some young officer whom he had befriended in difficulties had, on coming into a large property, determined similarly to befriend the daughter of his former colonel. Had she been alone in the world she would have declined to accept this aid from an unknown benefactor, but for her son's sake she felt that it would be wrong to do so. The idea that the money might come from Herbert Penfold had once or twice occurred to her, only to be at once dismissed, for had she really believed that it came from him she could not, even for Ralph's sake, have accepted it. He had, as she believed, quarrelled with her altogether without cause. Her letters had been unanswered, and she considered the quarrel to have been simply a pretext upon the part of Herbert to break off an engagement of which he was tired. Words dropped, apparently by accident, by Herbert's sisters had, before the misunderstanding commenced, favoured this idea, and although she had really loved him, her disposition was too spirited to allow her to take the steps she otherwise might have done to set herself right with him. At any rate, she had no ground whatever for believing that Herbert, after the breach of the engagement, entertained any such feelings towards her as would have led him to come forward to assist her in any way after she had become the wife of another. And so for 12 years she had continued to receive her quarterly income. She had established herself in a pretty little house near Dover, where several old friends of her father resided, and where she had plenty of pleasant society among the officers of the regiments stationed there. Although far from rivaling Portsmouth or Plymouth in life and bustle, Dover was a busy town during the time of the Great War. The garrison was a large one, the Channel cruisers often anchored under the guns of the castle, and from the top of the hills upon a clear day for months a keen lookout was kept for the appearance from the port of Boulogne of the expedition Napoleon had gathered there for the invasion of England. The white sails of the English cruisers as they sailed up and down the Channel were clearly visible, and occasionally a privateer could be seen making its way westward with a prize it had picked up off Texel. Military and naval matters were the sole topics of conversation, and by the time he was 15 Ralph had fully determined to follow in his grandfather's footsteps and to become a soldier. Having passed almost all her life among military men, Mrs. Conway had offered no objections to his wishes, and as several of her father's old friends had promised to use their influence on his behalf, there was little doubt that he would be enabled to procure a commission as soon as he reached the regulation age. It was not often that the postman called at Mrs. Conway's with letters, for postage was expensive, and the people in those days only wrote when they had something particular to say. Mrs. Conway had just made breakfast when Ralph came in with a letter in his hand. "Here's a letter for you, mother, but please don't open it until you have given me my breakfast. I'm very late now, and shall barely have time to get through with it and be there before the gates close." "Your porridge is quite ready for you, Ralph, so if you are late it'll be your own fault, not mine. The eggs will be in before you've eaten it. However, I won't open the letter until you have gone, because you'll only waste time by asking questions about it." Ralph began his bread and milk, and Mrs. Conway, stretching out her hand, took the letter he had laid beside his plate, and, turning it over, glanced at the direction to ascertain from which of her few correspondents it came. For a moment she looked puzzled, and then, with a little start, she laid it down by the side of her plate. She had recognized the handwriting, once so familiar to her. "What is it, mother? You look quite startled. Who's it from?" "It's from no one you know, Ralph. I think it's from a person I have not heard from for some years. At any rate, it will keep until you are off to school." "It's nothing unpleasant, I hope, mother. Your colour is quite gone, and you look downright pale." "What should be the matter, you silly boy?" Mrs. Conway said, with an attempt to smile. "What could there be unpleasant in a letter from a person I have not heard from for years? There, go on with your breakfast. I expect you'll hear some news when you get down into town. The guns in the castle have been firing, and I suppose there's news of a victory. They said yesterday that a great battle was expected to be fought against Napoleon somewhere near Leipzig." "Yes, I heard the guns, mother, and I expect there has been a victory." "I hope not." "Why do you hope not, Ralph?" "Why, of course, mother, I don't want the French to be beaten, not regularly beaten, till I'm old enough to have a share in it. Just fancy what a nuisance it would be if peace was made just as I get my commission." "There'll be plenty of time for you, Ralph," his mother said, smiling. Peace has been patched up once or twice, but it never lasts long, and after fighting for the last 20 years, it's hardly probable that the world is going to grow peaceful all at once. But there, it's time for you to be off. It only wants 10 minutes to 9, and you'll have to run fast all the way to be in time." When Mrs. Conway was alone, she took up the letter and turned it over several times before opening it. What could Herbert Penfold have written about after all these years? Mrs. Conway was but 36 years old now, and was still a pretty woman, and a sudden thought sent a flush of colour to her face. "Never," she said decidedly. "After the way in which he treated me, he cannot suppose that now—" And then she stopped. "I know I did love him once dearly, and it nearly broke my heart, but that was years and years ago. Well, let's see what he has to say for himself." And she broke open the letter. She glanced through it quickly, and then read it again more carefully. She was very pale now, and her lips trembled as she laid down the letter. "So," she said to herself in a low tone, "it is to him, after all, I owe all this." And she looked around her pretty room. "And I never once really suspected it. I am glad now," she went on after a pause, "that I did not, for, of course, it would have been impossible to have taken it, and how different the last 12 years of my life would have been. Poor Herbert! And so he really suffered, too, and he's thought of me all this time." For fully half an hour she sat without moving, her thoughts busy with the past, and then she began and took up the letter again and reread it several times. Its contents were as follows: "Dear Mrs. Conway, you will be doubtless surprised at seeing my handwriting, and your first impulse will naturally be to put this letter into the fire. I am not writing to ask you to forgive my conduct in the old days. I am but too well aware of how completely I have forfeited all right to your esteem or consideration. Believe me that I have suffered from my fault, and that my life has been a ruined one. I attempt to make no excuses. I am conscious that while others were to blame, I was most of all, and that is to my own weakness of will and lack of energy that the breach between us was due. However, all this is of the past, and can now interest you but little. You have had your own sorrows and trials, at which, believe me, I sincerely grieved. And now to my object in writing to you. Although still comparatively a young man, I have not many years to live. When last in London I consulted 2 of the first physicians, and they agreed that, as I had already suspected, I was suffering from heart disease, or rather perhaps from an enfeebled state of my heart, which may at any time cease to do its work. Naturally, then, I have turned my thoughts as to whom I should leave my property. My sisters are amply provided for. I have no other near relatives, and therefore consider myself free to leave it as I choose. I have long fixed my thoughts upon the daughter of a dear friend, the rector of Bilston. She is now 13 years old, and half my property is left her. I have left the other half to your son. The whole subject to an annuity to yourself, which you will not, I trust, refuse to accept. I have never thought of any woman but you, and I hope that you will not allow your just resentment against me to deprive me of the poor satisfaction of making what atonement lies in my power for the cruel wrong I formerly did you. Were I strong and in health, I can well imagine that you would indignantly refuse to receive any benefits from my hands, but knowing your kindness of heart, I feel sure that you will not sadden the last days of a doomed man by the knowledge that even after his death his hopes of ensuring the comfort of the one woman on earth he cared for are to be disappointed. I should like to know your son. Would it be too much to ask you to spare him for a while from time to time, so long as I live? I have a double motive, I say frankly, in thus asking him to come here. I wish him and my little pet, Mabel Withers, to come to like each other. I wish to divide my property between them, and yet I should be glad if the whole estate could remain intact. I should not be so foolish as to make a proviso that 2 persons who are as yet so young, and who may not in any way be suitable to each other, should marry. But nothing would please me so much as that they should take a fancy to each other, and, thrown together as they would be here, for Mabel is constantly at the house, it's just possible that one of those boy and girl affections which do sometimes, although perhaps rarely, culminate in marriage, might spring up between them. Whether that may be so in the present case I must leave to fate, but I should at any rate like to pave the way for such an arrangement by bringing the young people together. I need not say that it will be best that neither of them should have the slightest idea of what's in my mind, for this would be almost certain to defeat my object. If the proposal is agreeable to you, I hope that you will let Ralph come to me at the beginning of his holidays, which must, I fancy, be now near at hand. I think it will be as well that he should not know of my intention as to the disposal of my property, for it is better he should think that he will have to work for his living. But at the same time There would be no harm in his knowing that it is probable I shall help him on in life. This will make him bear better what would otherwise be a dull visit. But I leave this matter entirely in your hands. You know the boy, and I do not, and you can therefore better judge what will be best for him to know. And now, dear Mary, if you will pardon my once again calling you so, I remain your affectionate friend, Herbert Penfold. It was characteristic of Mrs. Conway that, at the first reading of this letter, she thought rather of the writer than of the bright prospects which his offer opened to her son. She thought rather of Herbert Penfold, her first love, now ill, if not dying, of the days of their engagement, its rapture, than of the fact that her son was to inherit half the Penfold estates. She had been sorely hurt at the time, and even after all these years it was a pleasure to her to know that the quarrel was not, as she had often thought at the time, a mere pretext for breaking off the engagement, but that Herbert had really loved her, had cared for her all these years, and had been the mysterious friend whose kindness had so lightened her cares. She said to herself, "I did not throw away my love after all," as with her eyes full of tears she stood at the window and looked out toward the sea. "He cared for me enough to be faithful all this time and to think of me constantly, while I had almost forgotten the past. I ought to have known all the time that he was acting under the influence of others, those sisters of his, of course. I was always certain they hated me, hated the thought of my becoming mistress of Penfold Hall. I knew the influence they had over him. Herbert had no will of his own. It was the only fault I ever saw in him, and they could twist him round their little fingers. And now he's going to make Ralph his heir, or at least his heir with the girl he speaks of. It's a grand thing for Ralph, for the estates were worth, he told Papa, $8,000 a year, and if Herbert's little romance comes off, Ralph will have all." Then she thought over the years he had been befriending her, and wondered what she should do about it. Finally, being a sensible woman, she decided to do nothing. Had she known it before, or learned the truth by other means, she would have refused absolutely to touch Herbert Penfold's money, but it would be indeed a poor return for his kindness were she now, when he was ill and feeble and was about to bestow still further benefits upon her, to refuse to permit him any longer to aid her. She wished, as she read the letter over again, that he had expressed some desire to see her. She should have liked to have thanked him in person, to have told him how grateful she felt for his care and kindness, to have taken his hand again, if but for a minute. But he had expressed no wish for a meeting, had never all these years made any effort to see her. She could read in the wording of the letter that he had been principally deterred from making any attempt to see her by the feeling that he had entirely forfeited her regard, and had offended her beyond a chance of forgiveness. And had she been asked the day before, she would doubtless have replied that she had no wish whatever, ever again, to meet Herbert Penfold, whereas now she felt almost aggrieved that he should express no wish to meet her, should have stayed away so long without making one effort to bring about reconciliation. She said pettishly, "Of all the faults that a man can have, I do not think there's one so detestable as that of self-distrust. Why could he not have said 10 years ago, 'I behaved badly, Mary. I treated you abominably, but forgive me and forget'? I was not wholly to blame, except that I allowed others to come between us. If he had come and said that, we could at least have been good friends. I have no patience with men who cannot stand up for themselves. Now, how much shall I tell Ralph?" And she again read the letter through. "Ralph," she said, when he came in to dinner, "you remember that letter I had this morning?" "Yes, I know, Mother. The one that made you turn so white. You said it was from an old friend, though why a letter from an old friend should upset anyone I can't make out. What was it about, Mother?" "Well, my boy, it contains a pleasant piece of news. Mr. Penfold, that is the name of the writer, was a friend of my family. He knew me long ago when we were young people, and at one time it seemed likely that we should be married. However, as you know, that never took place. However, it seems, as he says by his letter, that he has never altogether forgotten me, and he intends to help you on in life if you turn out as he would like to see you. He wishes you to go down to stay with him when your holidays begin." "Oh, that sounds nice," Ralph said, "and if he has got any boys about my own age it will be very pleasant." "He has no children, Ralph. He is what you might call an old bachelor, and lives with his sisters, or rather they live with him." "Oh, that doesn't sound very cheerful, Mother. An old gentleman with 2 old ladies alone in the house can't make much fun." "He's not an old gentleman, Ralph," Mrs. Conway said almost angrily. "I told you we were young people together. Still, it may not be very lively for you. But you must put up with that. He evidently means to be very kind to you, and it will be of great advantage to you going down to stay with him." "But what are you going to do with yourself, Mother, all alone here? I think he might have asked you as well as me." "Oh, I shall do very well, Ralph. I have plenty of friends here." "Where does Mr. Penfold live, Mother?" "Down in Dorsetshire. It's a very nice place, and only about a mile from the sea. But, as I say, I do not expect you will find it lively, but that you mustn't mind. It will be a very good thing for you, and will be well worth your while putting up with a little dullness for a while. Mr. Penfold is one of the kindest of men, but I do not think you will like his sisters much. Certainly you will not unless they are a good deal changed from what they were as I remember them. Still, you must try to get on with them as well as you can, and I dare say you will find some pleasant companions in the neighbourhood. I am sure you will do your best when I tell you that I am most anxious, for many reasons, that Mr. Penfold should like you." "Well, of course I will do my best, Mother, though I must say that the lookout is not, according to your description, a very cheerful one, and I would a deal rather stop at home with you." "Well, we can't always do as we like, Ralph, though that is a lesson you have as yet to learn. What day did you say your holidays begin?" "Next Monday week, Mother, but I do hope I may have 2 or 3 days sailing with Joe Knight the fisherman before I go." "Mr. Penfold says he will be glad to see you as soon as your holidays begin, Ralph. Still, I suppose a day or two will make no difference, so we'll settle that you'll go up on Friday. As you go down to school this afternoon, you'd better tell Rogerson the tailor to come up this afternoon to measure you for a suit of clothes. You must look decent when you go down, and you know except your Sunday suit you've got nothing fit to wear in such a house as that." "Oh, I'm afraid it's going to be a horrible nuisance altogether," Ralph said ruefully. "However, I suppose it's got to be done, as you say so, Mother. Though it's hard breaking in on my holidays like that. He might just as well have asked me in school time. One could have put up with it ever so much better if he took one out of old Harper's clutches for a bit. How long am I to stay there?" "I expect the greater part of your holidays, Ralph. I think he wants to get to know all about you." Ralph groaned loudly. "He may intend very kindly, but I wish he'd keep his good intentions to himself." "You think so now," Mrs. Conway said with a smile. "You won't think so when you're in the army, but will find a little extra allowance or a tip now and then very welcome." "I dare say I shall, Mother," Ralph said, brightening. "Anyhow, if the old gentleman, that is to say the gentleman, takes it into his head to make me an allowance, it'll take me off your hands, and I shall not be always feeling that I'm an awful expense to you. All right, Mother, I think I can promise that I'll be on my best behaviour, and will try hard to get on even with his sisters. I wish he'd asked Phil Landry to go down with me. 2 fellows can get on anywhere." "I should have very little hope of your making a good impression if you went there with your friend Phil," Mrs. Conway said, smiling. "I can believe in your conduct while you're alone, but I should have no hopes whatever of you if you and he were together." "But how am I to go, Mother? It seems such a tremendous way from here down into Dorsetshire." I've really not thought anything about it yet, Ralph, but probably Mr. Penfold will give you some instructions as to your journey when he hears from me that you are coming." Chapter 2: A Country Visit. When Ralph had gone off to school again, Mrs. Conway sat down to answer the letter, by no means an easy task, and she sat with the paper before her for a long time before she began. At last, with an air of desperation, she dipped her pen into the ink and began: "My dear Herbert Penfold, it's difficult to answer such a letter as yours, to say all one feels without saying too much, to express the gratitude with which one is full, but of which one feels that you do not desire the expression. First, a word as to the past. Now, that is irreparable. Why should I not speak freely? We were the victims of a mistake. You were misled respecting me. I foolishly resented the line you took, failed to make sufficient allowances for your surroundings, and even doubted a love that seemed to me to be so easily shaken. Thus, my pride was, perhaps, as much responsible for what happened as your too easy credence of tales to my disadvantage. At any rate, believe me that I have cherished no such feelings as those with which you credit me. Now that I know the truth, I can only regret that your life has been, as you say, spoiled by what can but be called a fatal misunderstanding. Next, I must thank you, although you make no allusion to it in your letter, for your kindness during past years. Of these, believe me, I never suspected that you were the author, and I need hardly say how deeply I have been touched at finding that the hand to which I and my boy owe so much is that of Herbert Penfold. Of this I will say no more. I leave you to picture my feelings and my gratitude. Also, most warmly I thank you for your intentions regarding my boy. He'll be ready to come to you on Friday week. I suppose his best way will be to go by coach to London and then down to you, or he could take passage perhaps in a coaster. He is very fond of the sea. We had settled that he should enter the army, but of course I consider that nothing will be decided on this or any other point as to his future until I know your wishes on the matter. Lastly, dear Herbert, believe me that the news that you have given me concerning your state of health has caused me deep sorrow, and I earnestly hope and trust that the doctors may be mistaken in your case, that you may have a long life before you, and that life may be happier in the future than it has been in the past. I remain your grateful and affectionate Mary Conway. A fortnight later Ralph Conway took his place on the outside of the coach for London. As to the visit to this unknown friend of his mother, he anticipated no pleasure from it whatever, but at the same time the journey itself was delightful to him. He had never during his remembrance been further away from Dover than Canterbury, and the trip before him was in those days a more important one than a journey half over Europe would be at the present time. In his pocket he carried a piece of paper, on which his mother had carefully written down the instructions contained in the letter she had received in answer to her own from Herbert Penfold. Sewn up in the lining of his waistcoat were 5 guineas, so that in case the coach was stopped by highwaymen, or any other misfortune happened, he would still be provided with funds for continuing his journey. Under the seat was a small basket filled with sandwiches, and his head ought to have been equally well filled with the advice his mother had given him as to his behaviour at Penfold Hall. As his place had been booked some days before, he had the advantage of an outside seat. Next to him was a fat woman who was going up to town, as she speedily informed her fellow passengers, to meet her husband, who was captain of a whaler. "I see in the Gazette today," she said, "as his ship was signalled off Deal yesterday, and with this here wind he'll be up at the docks tomorrow. So off I goes. He's been away nigh 18 months, and I know what men is. Why, bless you, if I wasn't there to meet him when he steps ashore, as likely as not he'd meet with friends and go on the spree, and I shouldn't hear of him for a week, and a nice old lad he'd make in his earnings. Young man, you're scrooging me dreadful. Can't you get a little further along?" Ralph replied, "It seems to me, ma'am, that it is you who are scrooging me. This rail is almost cutting into my side now." "Well, we must live and let live," the woman said philosophically. "You may think your star's nature hasn't made you as big as I am. Little people have their advantages. But we can't have everything our own way. That's what I tells my Jim. He's always a wanting to have his own way. Well, that comes from being a captain. But as I tells him, it's only reasonable as he is captain on board his ship, I should be captain in my house. I suppose you're going to school?" "No, I am not. My school is just over." "Going all the way up to London?" "Yes." "Oh, that's a mercy," the woman said. "I was afraid you might be only going as far as Canterbury, and then I might have got some big chap up here who'd squeeze me as flat as a pancake. Men's so unthoughtful, and seems to think as women can stow themselves away anywheres. I wish you'd feel and get your hand in my pocket, young man. I can't do it nohow, and I ain't sure that I've got my keys with me, and that girl Eliza'll be getting at the bottles and having men in, and then there'll be a nice to do with the lodgers. Can't you find it? It's in the fold somewhere." With much difficulty Ralph found the pocket hole and thrust his hand in. He was able to reassure his neighbour by feeling among a mass of odds and ends a bunch of keys. "Oh, that's a comfort," the woman said. "If one's mind wasn't at ease, one can't enjoy travelling." "I wish my body was at ease," Ralph said. "Don't you think you could squeeze them a little on the other side, and give me an inch or two more room?" "Oh, I'll try," the woman said, "as you seem a civil sort of boy." Whereupon she gave 2 or 3 heaves, which relieved Ralph greatly, but involved her in an altercation with her neighbour on the other side, which lasted till the towers of Canterbury came in sight. Here they changed horses at the Fountain Inn. "Look here, my boy," the woman said to Ralph. "If you feel underneath my feet you'll find a basket, and at the top there's an empty bottle. There'll be just time for you to jump down and get it filled for me, a shilling's worth of brandy, and fill it up with water. That girl Eliza flustered me so much with her worriting and questioning before I started that I had no time to fill it." Ralph jumped down and procured the desired refreshment, and was just in time to clamber up to his seat again when the coach started. He enjoyed the rapid motion and changing scene much, but he was not sorry when, as evening was coming on, he saw ahead of him a dull mist, which his fellow passenger told him was the smoke of London. It was 9 in the evening when the coach drove into the courtyard of the Bull Inn. The guard, who had received instructions from Mrs. Conway, at once gave Ralph and his box into the charge of one of the porters awaiting the arrival of the coach, and told him to take the box to the inn from which the coach for Weymouth started in the morning. Cramped by his 14 hours' journey, Ralph had at first some difficulty in following his conductor through the crowded street, but the stiffness soon wore off, and after 10 minutes' walking he arrived at the inn. The guard had already paid the porter, having received the money for that purpose from Mrs. Conway, and the latter, setting down the box in the passage, at once went off. Ralph felt a little forlorn, and wondered what he was to do next. But a minute later the landlady came out from the bar. "Do you want a bed?" she asked. "The porter should have rung the bell. I'm afraid we are full unless it's been taken beforehand. However, I'll see if I can make a shift somehow." "I should very much be obliged if you can," Ralph said, "for I don't know anything about London, and I'm going on by the Weymouth coach in the morning." "Oh, might your name be Conway?" "Yes, that's my name," Ralph said, surprised. "Oh, then there is a bedroom taken for you. A gentleman came 3 days ago and took it, saying it was for a young gent who's going through to Weymouth. Tom, take this box up to number 12. Supper's ready for you. I dare say you'd like a wash first." "That I should," Ralph replied, following the boots upstairs. In a few minutes he returned, and a waiter directed him to the coffee room. In a short time a supper consisting of fish, a steak, and tea was placed before him. Ralph fell to vigorously, and the care that had been bestowed by Mr. Penfield in securing a bedroom and ordering supper for him greatly raised him in the boy's estimation, and he looked forward with warmer anticipations than he had hitherto done to his visit to Mr. Penfold. As soon as he had finished he went off to bed, and in a few minutes was sound asleep. At 6:30 he was called, and after a hearty breakfast took his seat on the outside of the Weymouth coach. Sitting beside him were 4 sailors belonging, as he soon learned, to a privateer lying at Weymouth. They had had a long trip, and had been some months at sea, and as their ship was to lie for a fortnight at Weymouth while some repairs were being done to her, they had obtained a week's leave and had ran up to London for a spree. Weymouth during the war did a brisk trade, and was a favourite rendezvous of privateers, who preferred it greatly to Portsmouth or Plymouth, where the risk of their men being pressed to make up the quota of some man of war just fitted out was very great. The sailors were rather silent and sulky at first, at the cruise on land being nearly over, but after getting off the coach, where it changed horses, they recovered their spirits and amused Ralph greatly with their talk about the various prizes they had taken, and 1 or 2 sharp brushes with French privateers. Toward evening they became rather hilarious, but for the last 2 hours dozed quietly, the man sitting next to Ralph lurching against him heavily in his sleep, and swearing loudly when the boy stuck his elbow into his ribs to relieve himself of the weight. Ralph was not sorry, therefore, when at 10 o'clock at night the coach arrived at Weymouth. The landlord and servants came out with lanterns to help the passengers to alight, and the former, as Ralph climbed down the side into the circle of light, asked, "Are you Master Conway?" "That's my name," Ralph replied. "A bed has been taken for you, sir, and a trap will be over here at 9 o'clock in the morning to take you to Penfold Hall." Supper was already prepared for such passengers as were going to sleep in the hotel, but Ralph was too sleepy to want to eat, and had made a good meal when the coach stopped at 6 o'clock for 20 minutes to allow the passengers time for refreshments. At 8 o'clock the next morning he breakfasted. When he had finished, the waiter told him that the trap had arrived a few minutes before, and that the horse had been taken out to have a feed, but would be ready to start at 9. Ralph took a stroll for half an hour by the sea, and then returned. The trap was at the door, and his trunk had already been placed in it. The driver, a man of 23 or 24, was, as he presently told Ralph, stable helper at Penfold Hall. "I generally drive this trap when it's wanted," he said. "The coachman's pretty old now. He's been in the family well nigh 50 years. He's all right behind the carriage horses, he says, but doesn't like trusting himself in a pair-wheel trap." "How far is it?" Ralph asked. "A matter of 15 miles. Be a lot shorter if you'd got off last night at the nearest point the coach goes to, but the master told the coachman that he thought it would be pleasanter for you to come on here than to arrive there tired and sleepy after dark." "Yes, it will be much more pleasant. The road was very dirty, and I should not like to arrive at a strange house with my clothes all covered with dust, and so sleepy that I could hardly keep my eyes open, especially as I hear that Mr. Penfield's sisters are rather particular." "Rather ain't the word," the driver said. "They are particular, and no mistake. I don't believe as a master would notice whether the carriage was dirty or clean, but if there's a speck of dirt about they are sure to notice it. Not that they're bad mistresses, but they look about all right, I can tell you. Pretty sharp. I don't say that it ain't as well as they do, for the master never seems to care one way or the other, and lets things go anyhow. A nice gentleman he is, but I don't see much of him, and he don't drive in the carriage not once a month, and only then when he's going to the Board of Magistrates. He just walks about the garden morning and evening, and all the rest of the time he's shut up in the library with his books. It's a pity he don't go out more." "Are there any families about with boys?" Ralph asked. "Oh, not as I knows of. None of them's ever comes to the Hall, anyway. It's a pity there ain't some young ones around to wake up the place and make it lively. It'd give us a lot more work to do, I don't doubt, but we shouldn't mind that. I've heard it used to be different in the old squire's time, but it's always been so as long as I can remember. I don't live at the house, but down at the village. Jones, he lives over the stables, and there ain't no occasion to have more than one there, for there's only the 2 carriage horses in this." "How far is the sea from the house?" "Oh, it's about half a mile to the top of the cliff, and a precious long climb down to the water. But going round by Swanage, that's about 3 miles. You can drive down close to the sea, for there are no cliffs there." There was little more said during the drive. From time to time the man pointed out the various villages and country seats, and Ralph wondered to himself how he should manage to pass the next 3 weeks. It seemed that there'd be nothing to do and no one to talk to. He'd always been accustomed to the companionship of lots of boys of his own age, and during the holidays there was plenty of sailing and fishing, so that time had never hung on his hands. The present prospect therefore almost appalled him. However, he had promised his mother that he'd try to make the best of things, and he tried to assure himself that after all 3 weeks or a month would be over at last. After an hour and a half's drive they passed through a lodge gate into a park, and in a few minutes drew up at the entrance of Penfold Hall. An old servant came out. "Will you come with me into the library, sir? Mr. Penfold's expecting you. Your box will be taken up into your room." Ralph felt extremely uncomfortable as he followed his conductor across a noble hall, floored with dark polished oak, and panelled with the same material. A door opened, and a servant announced, "Master Conway." A gentleman rose from his chair and held out his hand. "I am glad to see you, Ralph Conway, and I hope your journey has been a pretty comfortable one. It's very good of you to come such a long distance to pay me a visit." "Mother wanted me to, sir," Ralph said honestly. "I don't think—" and he stopped. "You don't think you'd have come of your own accord, Ralph? No, that's natural enough, my boy. At your age I'm sure I should not have cared to give up my holidays and spend them in a quiet house among strangers. However, I wanted to see you, and I'm very glad you've come. I'm an old acquaintance of your mother's, you know, and so desired to make the acquaintance of her son. I think you are like her," he said, putting his hand on Ralph's shoulder and taking him to the window and looking steadily at him. "Yes, other people have said so, sir, but I'm sure I can't be like her a bit. Mother is so pretty, and I'm sure I'm not the least bit in the world, and I don't think it's nice for a boy to be like a woman." This was rather a sore point with Ralph, who had a smooth, soft face with large eyes and long eyelashes, and who had in consequence been nicknamed Sally by his schoolfellows. The name had stuck to him in spite of several desperate fights, and the fact that in point of strength and activity he was fully a match for any boy of his own age. But as there was nothing like derision conveyed by it, and it was indeed a term of affection rather than of contempt, Ralph had at last ceased to struggle against it. But he longed for the time when the sprouting of whiskers would obliterate the obnoxious smoothness of his face. Mr. Penfold had smiled at his remark. "I do not like girlish boys, Ralph, but a boy can have a girlish face and yet be a true boy all over, and I fancy that's your case." "I hope so, sir. I think I can swim or run or fight any of the chaps of my own age in the school, but I know I do look girlish about the face. I've done everything I could to make my face rough. I've sat in the sun and wetted it with sea water every 5 minutes, but it's no use." "I should not trouble about it. Your face will get manly enough in time, you may be sure, and I like you all the better for it, my boy, because you are certainly very like your mother. And now, Ralph, I want you to enjoy yourself as much as you can while you're here. The house itself is dull, but I suppose you'll be a good deal out of doors. I've hired a pony, which will be here today from Poole, and I have arranged with Watson, a fisherman at Swanage, that you can go out with him in his fishing boat whenever you are disposed. It's 3 miles from here, but you can ride over on your pony and leave it at the little inn there till you come back. I'm sorry to say I do not know any boys about here, but Mabel Withers, the daughter of my neighbour and friend, the clergyman of Bilston, the village just outside the lodge, has a pony and is a capital rider, and I'm sure she'll show you over the country. I suppose you have not had much to do with girls?" he added with a smile at seeing a slight expression of dismay on Ralph's face, which had expressed unmixed satisfaction at the first items of the programme. "No, sir, not much," Ralph said. "Of course some of my schoolfellows have sisters, but one does not see much of them." "Oh, I think you'll get on very well together. She's a year or two younger than you are, and I'm afraid she is considered rather a tomboy. She's been caught at the top of a tall tree examining the eggs in a nest, and in many similar ungirl-like positions, so you won't find her a dull companion. She's a great pet of mine, and though she may not be as good a companion as a boy would be for you, I'm sure when you once get to know her you'll find her a very good substitute. You see, not having had much to do with boys, I am not very good at devising amusement for you. I can only say that if there is anything you would like to do while you're here, you have only to tell me, and if it be possible I'll put you in the way of it." "Thank you very much, sir. You are extremely kind," Ralph said heartily, for with a pony and a boat it did seem that his visit would not be nearly so dull as he had anticipated. "I'm sure I shall get on capitally." Just at this moment there was a knock at the door. It opened, and a girl entered. "Ah, you've just come at the right moment, Mabel," Mr. Penfold said as she came in. "This is Ralph Conway, of whom I was speaking to you. Ralph, this is Mabel Withers. I asked her to come in early this morning so as to act as your guide round the place." The boy and girl shook hands with each other. She was the first to speak. "So you are Ralph. I've been wondering what you'd look like. Uncle has been telling me you were coming. I like your looks, and I think you're nice." Ralph was taken rather aback. This was not the way in which his schoolfellow's sisters had generally addressed him. "Oh, I think you look jolly," he said, "and that's better than looking nice." "Oh, I think they mean the same thing," she replied, "except that a girl says nice and a boy says jolly. I like the word jolly best, only I get scolded when I use it. Shall we go into the garden?" Although Ralph Conway had a very much pleasanter time than he had anticipated. Except at meals he saw little of the Miss Penfolds. His opinions as to these ladies, expressed confidentially to Mabel Withers, was the reverse of flattering. "I think," he said, "that they are the two most disagreeable old cats I have ever met. They hardly ever open their lips, and when they do it's only to answer some question of their brother. I remember in a fairy story there was a girl who, whenever she spoke, let fall pearls and diamonds from her lips. Whenever those women open their mouths I expect icicles and daggers to drop out." "Oh, they're not as bad as that," Mabel laughed. "I generally get on with them very well, and they are very kind in the parish, and altogether they're really not bad." "Then their looks belie them horribly," Ralph said. "I suppose they don't like me, and that would be all well enough if I had done anything to offend them, but it was just as bad the first day I came. I'm sure Mr. Penfold does not like it. I can see him fidget in his chair, and he talks away with me pretty well all the time we're at table, so as to make it less awkward. At least that's what I suppose. Well, I'm stopping with him and not with them, and that's one thing, and it doesn't make much difference to me if they do choose to be disagreeable. I like him immensely. He's wonderfully kind, but it would be awfully stupid work if it weren't for you, Mabel. I don't think I could stand it if it were not for our rides together." The young people had indeed got on capitally from the first. Every day they took long rides together, generally alone, although sometimes Mr. Penfold rode with them. Ralph had already confided to the latter, upon his asking him how he liked Mabel, that she was the jolliest girl he had ever met. "She has no nonsensical girl's ways about her, Mr. Penfold, but is almost as good as a boy to be with. The girls I have seen before have been quite different from that. Some of them always giggle when you speak to them, others have not got a word to say for themselves, and it's awfully hard work talking to them even for a single dance. Still, I like them better than the giggling ones. You see, Ralph, girls brought up in a town are naturally different to one like Mabel. They go to school and are taught to sit upright and to behave discreetly and to be generally unnatural. Mabel has been brought up at home and allowed to do as she liked, and she has consequently grown up to be what nature intended her to be. Perhaps some day all girls will be allowed the same chance of being natural that boys have, and backboards and other contrivances for stiffening them and turning them into little wooden figures will be unknown. It'll be a good thing, in my opinion, when that time arrives. Ralph was often down at the rectory, where he was always made welcome, Mr. Withers and his wife being anxious to learn as much of his disposition as they could. They were well satisfied with the result. "I fancy I know what's in Penfold's mind," the rector had said to his wife a few days after Ralph came down. "I believe he has already quite settled it in his mind that some day Mabel and this lad shall make a match of it." "Oh, how absurd, John! Why, Mabel is only a child." "Quite so, my dear, but in another 3 or 4 years she'll be a young woman. I don't mean that Penfold has any idea that they are going to take a fancy to each other at present, only that they will do so in the future. You know he said that he intends to leave a slice of his fortune to her, and I have no doubt that this lad will get the main bulk of his property. I've often told you about his engagement to the lad's mother, and how the breaking it off has affected his whole life. It's natural that a lonely man as he is should plan for others. He has no future of his own to look forward to, so he looks forward to someone else's. He's had no interest in life for a great many years, and I think he's making a new one for himself in the future of our girl and this lad. As far as I've seen of the boy, I like him. He's evidently a straightforward, manly lad. I don't mean to say that he has any exceptional amount of brains, or is likely to set the Thames on fire, but if he comes into the Penfold property, there'll not be much importance. He seems bright, good-tempered, and a gentleman, and that's quite good enough to begin with. At any rate, there's nothing for us to trouble about. If some day the young people get to like each other, the prospect's a good one for the child. If not, there's no harm done. At present there can be no objection to our yielding to Penfold's request and letting them ride about the country together. Mabel is, as you say, little more than a child, and it's evident that the lad regards her rather in the light of a boy companion than as a girl. And she is a bit of a tomboy, you know, Mary, and has very few girlish notions or ideas. They evidently get on capitally together, and we need not worry our heads about them, but let things go their own way with a clear conscience. At the end of the time agreed upon, Ralph returned home. "And so, Ralph, you have found it better than you expected?" his mother said to him at the conclusion of his first meal at home. "Oh, much better, mother. Mr. Penfold is awfully kind, and lets one do just what one likes. His sisters are hateful women, and if I had not been staying in the house I should certainly have played them some trick or other just to pay them out. I wonder why they disliked me so much. I could see it directly I arrived. But after all it didn't matter much except just at meals and in the evening. But though Mr. Penfold was so kind, it would have been very stupid if it had not been for Mabel Withers. We used to ride out or go for walks together every day. She's a capital walker, and very jolly, almost as good as a boy. She said several times that she wished she'd been a boy, and I wished so too. Still, of course, mother, I'm very glad I'm back. There is no place like home, you know. And then there are the fellows at school, and the games, and the sea, and all sorts of things. And it's a horrid nuisance to think that I've got to go down there regularly for my holidays. Still, of course, as you wish it, I will do so. And now that I know what it's like, it won't be so bad another time. Anyway, I'm glad I have got another 10 days before school begins." The following morning Ralph went down to the beach. "Why, Mr. Conway," an old fisherman said, "you're a downright stranger. I have missed you rarely." "I told you I was going away, Joe, and that I shouldn't get back until the holidays were nearly over." "I know you did," the fisherman replied. "Still, it does seem strange without you. Every time as I goes out I says to Bill if Master Conway was at home he'd be with us today. Bill, it don't seem no ways natural without him." And there's been good fishing too this season, first rate, and the weather has been just what it should be. Well, I'm back now, Joe, anyway, and I've got 10 days before school begins again, and I mean to make the most of it. Are you going out today?" "At 4 o'clock, the fisherman said. "Daylight fishing ain't much good just now. We take twice as many as night." "No trouble with the Frenchies?" "Lord bless you, I ain't seen a French sail for months. Our cruisers are too sharp for 'em, and though they say a good many privateers run in and out of their ports in spite of all we can do, and a lot of our ships get snapped up. But we don't trouble about 'em. Why, bless your heart, one of them was to run across us, they'd only just take our fish and as like as not pay us for them with a cask or two of spirits. Fish is a treat to them Frenchies, for their fishing boats have to keep so close over to their own shores that they can't take much. Besides, all the best fishermen are away in the privateers, and the lads have to go fight Boney's battles with the Austrians or Russians or Spanish or our chaps, or else to go on board their ships of war and spend all their time cooped up in harbour, for they're scarce shown now beyond the range of the guns of their forts. Well, will you come this evening?" "Yes, I think so, Joe. My mother doesn't much care about my being out at night, you know. But as I've been away all this time to please her, I expect she'll let me do what I like for the rest of the holidays." "Don't you come if your mother don't like it, Master Conway. There's never no good comes of boys vexing their mothers. I've known misfortune to follow it over and over again. Boys think as they know best what's good for 'em, but they don't, and sooner or later they're sure to own it to themselves." "Oh, I shouldn't do it if I knew she really didn't like it, Joe, but I don't think she does mind my going out with you at any time. She knows she can trust you. Besides, what harm could come of it? You never go out in very rough weather." "We're pretty roughish sometimes, Master Conway." "Oh, yes, pretty rough, but not in a gale, you know. Besides, the Heartsease could stand a goodish gale. She's not very fast, you know, but she is as safe as a house." "She's fast enough," the old fisherman said in an injured tone. "But you young gentlemen is never content unless a boat's heeling over gunwale under and passing everything she comes across. What's the good of that to a fisherman? He goes out to catch fish, not to strain his craft all over by running races against one another. Now, an hour faster or slower makes no difference, and the Heartsease is fast enough for me, anyhow." "No, she isn't, Joe. I've heard you use bad language enough when anything overhauls and passes her on the way back to port." "That may be," the fisherman admitted. "And on the way home I grant you that a little more speed might be an advantage, for the first comer's sure to get the best market. Nope, the Heartsease ain't very fast, I own up to that, but she is safe and she is steady, and she has plenty of storage room and a good roomy cabin as you can stand upright in, and needn't break your back by stooping, as you have to do on board some craft I could name." "Now that's true enough, Joe," the boy said. "But what's more, she's a lucky boat, for it's seldom that she goes out without getting a good catch." "Oh, I think that's more judgment than luck, Joe, though there may be some luck in it too." "I don't know about that, Master Conway. Of course one wants a sharp eye to see where the shoals are moving, but I believes in luck. Well, sir, shall I see you again before the afternoon?" "I don't much expect so, Joe. I've got to call at some other places, and I don't suppose I shall have time to get down before. If I'm coming I shall be sure to be punctual, so if I'm not here by 4, you go off without me." Mrs. Conway made no objection when Ralph proffered his request. He had sacrificed the greater part of his holidays to carry out her wishes, and paying a visit to Mr. Penfold, and although she did not like his being out all night fishing, she could not refuse his request. And indeed, as she knew that Joe Knight was a steady man and not fond of the bottle, there was no good reason why she should object. She therefore cheerfully assented, saying at the same time, "I'll pack a basket for you, Joe, before you start, Ralph. There's a nice piece of cold meat in the house, and I'll have that and a loaf of bread and some cheese put up for you. I know what these fishing excursions are. You intend to be back at a certain time, and then the wind falls or the tide turns, or something of that sort, and you can't make the harbour. You know what a fright you gave me the first time you went out fishing with Joe Knight. You were to have been back at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you didn't get in until 3 o'clock the next morning." "Oh, I remember, Mother. And there you were on the quay when we came in. I was awfully sorry about that." "Well, I have learned better since, Ralph, and I know now that there's not necessarily any danger, even if you don't come back by the time I expect you. And of course each time I've fidgeted and you've come back safe, I've learned a certain amount of sea knowledge, and have come to know that sailors and fishermen are not accountable for time, and that if the wind drops or tide turns they're helpless in the matter, and have only to wait till a breeze comes up again." "I think, Mother, you ought to like my going out at night better than in the daytime." "Oh, why is that, Ralph?" "Because, Mother, if I go out in the daytime and don't get back until after dark, you worry yourself, and having no one to talk to, sit here wondering and wondering until you fancy all sorts of things. Now, if I go out in the evening and I don't come back in the morning at the hour you expect, you see that's fine and bright, and that there is nothing to make you uneasy. Or if you do feel fidgety, you can walk down to the beach and talk to the boatmen and fishermen, and of course they can tell you at once that there's nothing to worry about, and very likely point the boat out to you in the distance." "Well, Ralph, perhaps that's so, although I own I never look at it in that light before." Chapter 3. Run Down. "There's a nice breeze," Ralph said as he joined the fishermen at the appointed hour. "Yes, it's just right, neither too light nor too heavy. It's rather thick, and I shouldn't be surprised if we get it thicker, but that won't matter." For in those days not one ship ploughed the water of our coast for every 50 that now make their way along it. There were no steamers, and the fear of collision was not ever in the minds of those at sea. "Where's Bill, Joe?" "That young scamp," the fisherman said angrily. "Nothing will do for him but to go a climbing up the cliffs this morning, and just after you left us, news come that the young varmint had fallen down and twisted his foot, and doctors say it'll be a fortnight before he can put a boot on. Then the old woman began a crying over him. Well, as I told her, if anyone ought to cry, it'd be me who's got to hire another boy in his place to do his work. A touch of the strap would be the best thing for him, the young rascal. You're not going to take another boy out tonight, are you, Joe? No, Master Conway, I knows you like a-doing things. You have been out enough with me to know as much about it as Bill, and after all, there ain't a very great deal to do. The trawl ain't a heavy one, and as I'm accustomed to work it with Bill, I can do it with you. The Heartsease was a good-sized half-decked boat, some 26 feet long and 8 feet beam. She was very deep and carried 3 tons of stone ballast in her bottom. She drew about 6 feet of water. She had a lot of freeboard, and carried 2 lug sails and a small mizzen. They got in the small boat and rowed off to her. There was no call for you to bring that basket, Master Conway. I know you're fond of a fish fried just when it's taken out of the water, and I've got bread and a keg of beer, to say nothing of a mouthful of spirits in case we get wet. Not that it looks likely we shall, for I doubts if there'll be any rain tonight. I think there'll be more wind, perhaps, and that it'll get thicker, and at least that's my view of the weather. They sailed straight out to sea. Joe had fitted his boat to be worked with the aid of a boy only. He had a handy winch, by which he hoisted his heavy lug sails, and when the weather was rough, hauled up his trawls. Of these he carried 2, each 14 feet long, and fished with them 1 out on each quarter. When he reached the fishing ground 6 miles out, Joe lowered the mizzen lug and reefed the main, for there was plenty of wind to keep the boat going at the pace required for trawling under the reduced sail. Then the trawls were got overboard, each being fastened to the end of a stout spar lashed across the deck, and projecting some 8 feet on either side, by which arrangement the trawls were kept well apart. They were hauled alternately once an hour, 2 hours being allowed after they were put down before the first was examined. By the time the first net came up, the sun had set. The wind had freshened a bit since they had started, but there was no sea to speak of. The night had set in thick, and the stars could only occasionally be seen. Joe had picked out 2 or 3 fine fish from the first haul, and these he took down and soon had sizzling in a frying pan over the fire, which he had lighted as soon as the boat was under sail. "These are for you, Master Conway," he said. "With your permission I shall stick to that here piece of beef your mother was good enough to send. Fish ain't no treat to me, and I don't often get meat. Keep your eye lifting while I'm down below. There ain't many craft about in these days. Still, we might tumble against one." "I should not see a light far in this mist, Joe." "No, you wouldn't, and what's worse, many of them don't carry no lights at all." "It would be a good thing, Joe, if there was a law to make all vessels carry lights." "Aye, aye, lad, but you see in war times it ain't always convenient. A peaceful merchantman don't want to show her lights to any privateers that may happen to be cruising about, and you may be sure that the privateer don't want to attract the attention of peaceful traders until she's close upon them, or to come under the eye of any of our cruisers. No, there ain't many lights shown now, not in these waters. Folks prefer to risk the chance of running into each other rather than that of being caught by a French privateer." Now that the trawls were out, there was no occasion for anyone to attend to the helm. Consequently, when Joe announced that the fish were ready, Ralph went down and joined him in the cabin. The first hours of the night passed quietly. Once an hour a trawl was hauled in and got on board, and as the catches were satisfactory, Joe was in capital spirit. "You've brought good luck, Master Conway, and I notice as generally do when you're out with me. I'm getting more fish tonight than I've any night for weeks, and if it goes on like this till morning I shall make a good thing of it. I wants it bad enough, for I'm in arrears a bit of my rent. The war's made everything so terrible dear that's as much as a poor man can do to keep his head above water." "What time is it now, Joe, do you think?" "Oh, about 2 o'clock, I reckon. It'll begin to get light in a couple of hours, and at 5 we'll up nets and make our way back." He had scarcely spoken when he shouted, "Ship ahoy! Look out for yourself, lad!" Startled by the suddenness of the cry, Ralph looked round. He saw a crest of white foam a few yards away in the darkness. A moment later something dark passed over his head and a rope brushed his cheek, and as it did so a black mass struck the boat. There was a crash, a shock, and the Heartsease, after first heeling deeply over under the pressure, suddenly sank down like a stone. Ralph had staggered under the force of the collision and would have fallen back as the boat heeled over, but instinctively he threw up his arms and his hand came in contact with the rope that had an instant before touched his cheek. He seized it with both hands and threw his legs round it as the boat went down under his feet, the whole thing being so sudden that it was nearly a minute before he could realize what had happened. Then he heard voices talking close by, and as it seemed above him. "Hello! Hello! Help!" he shouted. A few seconds later the light of a lantern was flashed down upon him. Then a figure crawled out on the spar projecting above his head, seized him by the collar, and lifted him from the bobstay to which he was clinging onto the bowsprit. A minute later he was standing on deck. "Thank you," he exclaimed. "Have you seen anything of the man who was with me? There were two of us on board. If not, please look for him at once." "I am afraid it is no use," one of the men said, with a strong foreign accent. "He has gone down and will never come up again. You come along with me to the captain." An uneasy feeling seized Ralph as he listened. He could see nothing, for the lantern had been placed in a bucket the moment he touched the deck. At this moment a hail came from the stern of the vessel, and Ralph's fears were at once realized, for it was in French. The reply was in the same tongue, and he was led aft. "Take him down below, Jacques, and let's see what he is like. We have suffered no damage, I hope." "Not as far as I could see by the light of the lantern, but the carpenter has gone below to see if she is making water." The captain led the way down into the cabin. This was comfortably furnished and lighted by a swinging lamp. "Do you come down too also, Jacques. I shall want you to interpret." The captain was surprised when he saw by the light of the lamp that the person they had rescued was a lad, well dressed, and evidently above the condition of a fisherman. "Now, young sir, who are you?" he asked, "and what have you to say for yourself?" The question was translated by Jacques. "I like that," the lad said indignantly. "What have I to say for myself? I think it's what you have to say for yourselves. We were quietly fishing when you ran over us and sank the boat and drowned my friend Joe, and haven't even stopped for a moment to see if you could pick him up. I call it shameful and inhuman." The French captain laughed as Jacques translated the speech, the purport of which he had indeed made out for himself, for although he did not speak English he understood it to some extent. "Tell him it was his fault as much as ours. We did not see him till we struck him, and as for his companion, what chance was there of finding him on such a dark night as this? Why, by the time we had hove round and got back again we might not have hit it within a quarter of a mile. Besides, if he had been alive he would have shouted." Ralph saw, when he understood what the captain said, that there was truth in his words, and that the chances of discovering Joe would indeed have been slight even had the vessel headed round. "May I ask," Ralph said, "what ship is this, and what are you doing with me?" "The ship is La Belle Marie of Dunkirk. As to what we are going to do with you it is not so easy to say. Of course you can jump overboard again if you like, but if not you can stay on board until we have an opportunity of putting you ashore somewhere. How did you come to be on board a fishing smack, for I suppose it was a smack that we ran down?" "I live in Dover," Ralph replied, "and had only come out for a night's fishing." "Well, you are in luck," the captain said. "That will do, Jacques. Take him forward and sling a hammock for him. Hang up his clothes in the cook's galley. They will be dry by the time he wakes." Ralph asked no questions as he was taken forward as to the character of La Belle Marie. 6 guns were ranged along each side of her decks, and this, and the appearance of the captain's cabin, was sufficient to inform him that he had fallen into the hands of a French privateer. The craft had indeed left Dunkirk soon after nightfall, and was making her way down channel with every sail set when she had run down the unfortunate fishing boat. Jacques, as he hung up the hammock, explained to the sailors, who crowded round, the character of the passenger who had so unexpectedly come on board. "Poor lad," one of the sailors said good naturedly. "He'll be some time before he sees his mother again. He hasn't got a very bright outlook before him. A long voyage and then a prison. I will go and see if the cook has got some water hot. A glass of spirits will do him good." A few minutes later Ralph was wrapped up in a blanket, and the warm glow produced by that and the glass of strong grog soon sufficed to send him soundly to sleep, in spite of the painful uncertainty of his position and of his sorrowful thought of his mother, who would in the morning be inquiring for him in vain. It was nearly midday before he woke. Looking round he saw that he had the forecastle to himself. His clothes were lying on a chest close by, and in a few minutes he was on deck. A sense of disappointment stole over him. He had, while he was dressing, entertained the hope that on going on deck he would see an English cruiser in pursuit, but the wind had dropped and it was still thick, and his vision was confined to a circle of a quarter of a mile in diameter. Jacques nodded to him good temperedly, for all on board the privateer were in high spirits. Their voyage had begun propitiously. The darkness of the preceding night had enabled them to run the gauntlet of the British cruisers in the narrow part of the channel, They were now well down the coast of France, and the fog reduced their chances of being seen by an enemy to a minimum. "Where are we?" Ralph asked. "We are somewhere off the mouth of the Seine, and I guess some 15 miles from the land." "Oh, we are going down the channel, then," Ralph said. "And where are we going to?" "Ha ha! That question is for the captain to answer if he chooses," Jacques said. "Are we going to touch at the next French port?" Ralph asked anxiously. "Not that I know of, unless we have the luck to pick up one of your merchantmen, and we might then escort her into port. But unless we do that, we do not touch anywhere, luckily for you, because after all it's a good deal pleasanter cruising in the Belle Marie than kicking your heels inside a prison. I know pretty well, for I was for 4 years a prisoner in your English town of Dorchester. That is how I came to speak your language. It was a weary time of it, though we were not badly treated, not half so bad as I have heard that the men in some other prisons were. So I owe you English no ill will on that account, and from what I have heard some of our prisons are worse than any of yours. I used to knit stockings and wraps for the neck. My old mother taught me when I was a boy, and as we were allowed to sell these things we got pretty comfortable. Besides, what's the use of making yourself unhappy? I had neither wife nor children to be fretting about me at home, so I kept up my spirits." "How did you get back?" Ralph asked. "Were you exchanged?" "No," Jacques answered. "I might have waited long enough before that. I can't make out myself why the two governments don't agree to exchange prisoners more quickly. I suppose they take about an equal number. Your men of war ships capture more prisoners than ours, but we make up for it by the number of our privateers bring in. At any rate, they might exchange as many as they can, say, once in 6 months. One would have thought they would be glad to do so as to save themselves the trouble and expense of looking after and feeding such a number of useless mouths. Governments always have curious ways." "But how did you get away from prison?" Ralph asked. "It was a woman," Jacques replied. "It is always women who help men out of scrapes. It was the wife of one of the jailers. She used to bring her husband's dinner sometimes when we were exercising in the yard. When I first went there she had a child in her arms, a little thing about a year old. I was always fond of children, for we had a lot at home, brothers and sisters, and I was the eldest. She saw me look at it one day, and I suppose she guessed it reminded me of home, so she stopped and let me pat its cheek and talk to it. Then I knitted it some socks and a little jacket and other things, and that made a sort of friendship between us. You can always win a woman's heart by taking notice of a child. Then she got to letting me carry it about on my shoulder while she took her husband's dinner into him, if he did not happen to be in the yard, and when the little thing was able to totter it would hold on to my finger, and was always content to stay with me while she was away. So it went on till the child was 4 years old. One day it was running across the court to its mother as she came out from the prison. Two of the men were what you call skylarking, and running one way while the child was running the other. One of them knocked it down heavily. It was an accident, and if he had picked it up and been sorry there would have been an end to it, but instead of that brute burst into a loud laugh. By this time I was as fond of the child as if it had been my own, and I rushed furiously at him and knocked him down. As he sprang to his feet he drew a knife he used in wood carving and came at me. I caught the blow on my arm and closed with him, and we fell together. The guard in the yard rushed up, pulled us apart. We both got a fortnight's close confinement for fighting. The first time I came into the yard again and met the woman with her child, the little one ran to me, but the woman, a little to my surprise, said nothing. As she passed I lifted the child up, and after giving him a hug and a kiss she said, "Mammy gave me this to give to you," and she put a little note into my hand. I took the first opportunity to read it in a quiet corner. It was as follows: "Dear Jacques, I saw how nobly you stood up for my Carrie the other day, and how you got wounded in protecting her. You have always been good to her. I have often thought I might help you to escape, but was afraid to try. Now I will do so. It will not be easy, but I will manage it. Do not be impatient. The child will give you another note when I have quite arranged things. I shall not talk much to you in future, or else when you have got away I may be suspected, so do not be surprised at my seeming coldness." After that the woman only brought her child once a week or so to the prison, and only gave me a nod as she passed through the yard. Upon the third visit of the child it gave me a little packet containing 2 or 3 small steel saws and a little bottle of oil. On the paper which held them was written, "For the bars. You shall have a rope next time." Sure enough, next time the child had hidden in its frock a hank of very thin cord, which I managed, as I was playing with her, to slip unobserved into my breast. "Mamma says more next time." And next time another hank came. There was a third, and a note: "Twist the 3 ropes together, and they will be strong enough to bear you. On the 3rd night from this, Saw through the bars and lower yourself into court. There will be no moon. Go to the right-hand corner of the court in the rear of the prison. Fasten a knife to one end of the cord and throw it over the wall. I shall be waiting there with a friend. Directly you feel the cord jerk, climb up to the top of the wall. If you can find something to fasten your end of the rope to, you can slide down it. If not, just jump. There will be a boat ready to take you away." And it all turned out well. It was a pitch-dark night, raining and blowing, and the sentries kept inside their boxes. I got up to the top of the wall all right, and was able to fasten the rope onto the spikes and slide down on the other side. The woman was there with a man whom she told me was her brother. They took me to a creek 2 miles away, and there put me on board a boat, and I was rowed out to a smuggling craft, which at once set sail, and 2 days later I was landed at Cherbourg. So that's how I came to learn English. Did you ever hear whether the woman who helped you was suspected? I saw her brother 2 months afterward on one of the trips that the craft he belonged to made. He said that of course there were a great many inquiries made, and his sister had been questioned closely. She swore that she had hardly spoken to me for the last 2 months, and that she had given me nothing, which in a way was true enough, for she had not handed them to me herself. The prisoners bore her out about her not coming near me, for it had been noticed that she was not as friendly as she had been. Some had thought her ungrateful, while others had fancied that she was angry at my interfering and making a tumult about the child. Anyway, whatever suspicions they might have had, they could prove nothing. They forbade her entering the prison in future, but she didn't mind that, so long as her husband, who had been employed a good many years there, did not lose his situation. He had been kept by her in entire ignorance of the whole affair, and was very indignant at her having been suspected. I sent her a letter of thanks by her brother, and a little present for her and one for the child. The brother was to give them to her as if from himself, so that the husband should not spell a rat, and of course to make her understand who they came from. "Well, I only hope, Jacques," Ralph said, "that when I get shut up in one of your prisons I shall find some Frenchwoman to aid me to escape, just as you found an Englishwoman to help you. Only I hope it won't be 4 years coming about." "I think we look sharper after our prisoners than you do. Still, it may be. But it will be some time before you are in prison, and if you play your cards well and learn to speak our language and make yourself useful, I do not think the captain is likely to hand you over to the authorities when we get back to a French port again." "I am quite ready to do my best to learn the language and to make myself useful," Ralph said. "It's always a good thing to know French, especially as I am going into the army some day. That is, if I get back again in time." "Oh, I think you will do so," Jacques said. "You keep up your spirits well, and that is the great thing. There are many boys that would sit down and cry if they found themselves in such a scrape as you have got into." "Cry?" Ralph repeated indignantly. "You don't suppose a boy of my age is going to cry like a girl? An English boy would be ashamed to cry, especially when Frenchmen were looking on." Jacques laughed good-naturedly. "There would be nothing to be ashamed of. We are not like you cold English. A Frenchman laughs and sings when he is pleased, and cries when he is sorry. Why shouldn't he?" "Oh, I can't tell you why," Ralph replied. "Only we don't do it. I don't say I shouldn't halloo out if I were hurt very much, though I should try my best not to. But I feel sure I shouldn't cry like a great baby. Why, what would be the good of it?" Jacques shrugged his shoulders. "People are different," he said. "A man is not a coward because he cries. I have seen 2 boys fighting and pulling each other's hair and crying all the time, but they fought on. They did not cry because they were afraid." "Pulling each other's hair!" Ralph repeated contemptuously. "They ought to have been ashamed of themselves, both of them. I don't call that fighting at all. I should call it disgusting. Why, in England even girls would hardly pull each other's hair. I've seen 2 or 3 fights between fishwomen in Dover, and even they do not go on like that. If that's the way French boys fight, no wonder our soldiers and sailors—" But here it struck Ralph that the remark he was about to make would be altogether out of place under present circumstances. He therefore seized with an opportune fit of coughing, and then turned the conversation by asking Jacques at what rate he thought the vessel was slipping through the water. A few minutes later the first mate came up and told Jacques to inform Ralph that the captain had ordered him to be supplied with clothes similar to those worn by the rest of the crew, and that he was to be told off to take his post regularly as a boy in the starboard watch. Ralph was well pleased at the news. He felt that his best chance was to make himself useful on board, and to become one of the crew as soon as possible, so that in case an English merchantman was met with and captured, he should not be sent with her crew as a prisoner to a French port. As long as he was on board, various opportunities of escape might present themselves. He might slip away in port, or the brig might be captured by an English cruiser or privateer, whereas once lodged in a French prison the chances of such good fortune as had befallen Jacques were very slight indeed. He therefore at once turned to with alacrity. That he would have a hard time of it for a bit he felt sure, for although in Jacques he had evidently found a friend, he saw by the scowling glances of several of the men as he passed near them that the national feeling told heavily against him. Nor was it surprising that it should be so. The animosity between the two nations had lasted so long that it had extended to individuals. Englishmen despised as well as disliked Frenchmen. They were ready to admit that they might be brave, but considered them as altogether wanting in personal strength. The popular belief was that they were half starved, and existed chiefly upon frogs and hot water, with a few bits of bread and scraps of vegetables in it, which they called soup, and that upon the sea especially they were almost contemptible. Certainly the long succession of naval victories that our fleets had won afforded some justification for our sailors' opinion of the enemy, but in fights between detached vessels the French showed many times that, in point of courage, they were in no way inferior to our own men, and indeed our victories were mainly due to two causes. In the first place, the superior physique and stamina of our men, the result partly of race and partly of feeding. They were constantly able to work their guns faster and longer than could their adversaries. In the second place, the British sailor went into battle with an absolute conviction that he was going to be victorious, while the Frenchman, on the other hand, although determined to do his best to win, had from the first doubts whether the British would not be, as usual, victorious. It is probable that the French sailors hated us far more than our men did them. We had lowered their national prestige, had defeated them whenever we met them, had blockaded their ports, ruined their trade, inflicted immense damage upon their fisheries, and subsidized other nations against them, and were the heart and centre of the coalition against which France was struggling to maintain herself. It was not therefore surprising that among the 110 men on board La Belle Marie there were many who viewed Ralph with hostile eyes, and who only refrained from personal violence owing to the strict order the captain had given that he should be well treated. Toward midday the fog lifted suddenly, and the wind freshened, and lookouts were stationed in the tops. There was little hope indeed of any English merchantmen having come over so far toward the French coast, but British cruisers might be anywhere. A few distant sails could be seen far out on the horizon, proceeding up or down channel, but the captain of La Belle Marie had no idea of commencing operations until very much further away from the shores of England. All day the vessel ran down the French coast, and although he was a captive, and every mile reeled off the log took him further from home, Ralph could not help admiring the speed at which the brig slipped through the water, cutting the waves with her sharp bow and leaving scarcely a ripple behind her, so fine and clean was her run. Very different was this smooth gliding motion from the quick plunge and shock of the bluff-bowed fishing boat to which he was accustomed. The sails had been scrubbed until there was not a speck upon them, the masts were lofty and tapering, the rigging neat and trim, and every stay as taut as iron. We could fight our ships better than the French, but as far as building and rigging went they were vastly our superiors, and La Belle Marie looked to Ralph almost like a gentleman's yacht in its cleanness and order, and in these respects vied with the men of war that he had so often watched from the heights of Dover. He had, however, but little time for admiration, for he was kept at work rubbing and polishing the guns and brasswork, and was not idle for a minute from the time he came on deck dressed as a cabin boy on the morning after he was picked up until sunset. There were two French boys about his own age forward, and as soon as his work was done and the evening watch set, they began to torment him, for, acting as they did as servants to the officers, they did not take share in the watch. Fortunately Jacques had gone below at the same time as Ralph, and when the boys, finding that their taunts had no effect whatever upon Ralph, began to get bolder, and one of them snatched off his cap, Jacques interfered at once. "Look here, youngsters," he said, "this young English boy is at present one of the crew of this brig, and he has just the same right of fair treatment as anyone else. So I warn you, if you interfere with him you will have to fight him fairly. I know enough of these English boys to know that with your hands you would not have the least chance with him. He could thrash you both at once, for even little English boys do not wrestle, tear, and kick, but hit straight out just as the men do. With swords it would be different, but in a row between you and him it would be just the naked hands. So I advise you to leave him alone, for if you make him fight I will see fair play. All the time I was a prisoner in England I was well treated by his people, and just as I was treated myself and saw other French prisoners treated, so I will see him treated. Before this voyage is over it is not impossible the tables will be turned, and that you may find yourselves prisoners in the hands of the English. So I recommend you to behave to him in the same way you would like to be treated yourselves, if you were taken prisoners. I can see the lad is good-tempered and willing. He is a stranger here among us all. He can't speak a word of our language, and he has a right to fair treatment. When he gets to know our language he will be able to shift for himself, but until he does, I mean to look after him, and anyone who plays tricks on him has got to talk to me." As Jacques Cléry was one of the most powerful and active men on board the brig, this assertion was sufficient to put a stop to practical joking with Ralph, and the lad had a much easier time of it than he expected. The men, finding him willing to work and anxious to oblige in every way, soon took to him, and by paying attention to their talk, and asking the French name of every object on board the ship, it was not many days before Ralph found himself able so far to understand that he could obey orders, and pull and haul on any sheet that needed it. Upon the second day, the wind having dropped again, more sail was set, and when the word was given to go aloft he went up with the rest, and although he was of little practical use in loosing the gaskets, he soon shook off his first feelings of discomfort and nervousness on seeing how carelessly and unconcernedly the men on each side of him did their work, and before he had been many days at sea was as quick and active aloft as any of the hands on board the brig. After running down nearly as far as Bordeaux, the vessel's head was pointed west, and by nightfall the French coast was out of sight. A vigilant lookout was now kept, one man being constantly stationed aloft, and by the increased animation of the crew Ralph judged that they would soon arrive at a point where they should be on the course of homeward bound merchantmen. He had quite made up his mind that, although ready in all other matters to do his duty as one of the crew of La Belle Marie, nothing should induce him to take part in a fight against his own countrymen. As soon as night fell, sail was reduced, and in the morning, when at 8 bells Ralph came on deck with his watch, he found that the whole of the upper sails had been taken off her, and the topsails lowered on to the cap, and the brig was only moving through the water at the rate of 2 or 3 knots an hour. He guessed that she must be just upon the track of ships, and that her object in thus taking off sail was to catch sight of vessels in the distance, while she herself would be unobserved by them. During the course of the day several sail were seen passing, but all at a considerable distance. Either the captain did not think that it was safe to commence operations at present, or he did not like the look of some of the passing vessels, but at any rate he made no movement to close with any of them, and it was not until nightfall that sail was again hoisted and the brig proceeded on her course. Ralph noticed that she carried no light, and that even the binnacle was carefully shaded so that its light could not be seen except by the helmsman. At midnight his watch went on deck, and Ralph perceived that while he had been below the sail had again been greatly reduced, and noticed that from time to time the officer on watch swept the horizon with his night glass. He apparently observed nothing until about 2 o'clock in the morning, when he stood for some time gazing intently astern. Then he turned and gave an order to a sailor, who went below, and 2 or 3 minutes later the captain came on deck. After speaking to the officer, he too gazed intently astern. Then the ship's course was suddenly changed, the sheets eased off, and for half an hour she ran at a sharp angle to the course she had before been following. Then she was brought up into the eye of the wind and laid to. Although Ralph strained his eyes in the direction in which the captain had been looking, he could see nothing, but he had no doubt a sail had been seen coming up astern, and that the object of the change of course was to let her pass them without their being seen. He rather wondered that, instead of running off the wind, the captain had not put her about so as to take her position to windward instead of to leeward of the vessel behind. But he soon arrived at the object of the manoeuvre. There were no stars to be seen, and the bank of clouds overhead stretched away to the east, and the horizon there was entirely obscured, but to the west the sky was brighter, and a vessel would be clearly visible to the eye. The brig, therefore, in the position she had taken up, could not be seen, while she herself would obtain a full view of the other as she passed her. In an hour the other ship came along. She was a large ship, full rigged, and the French sailors, who had all come on deck, now clustered against the bulwarks and eagerly discussed her. She was about 2 miles to windward, and opinions differed as to whether she was a man of war or an Indiaman. Ralph rather wondered that the privateer had not tried to get alongside in the darkness and take the vessel by surprise, but he understood now that there was a strong probability that La Belle Marie might have caught a Tartar, and have suddenly run herself under the guns of a British frigate. As soon as the vessel had passed, the braces were manned and the yards swung round, and the brig continued her course. She was brought up almost to the wind's eye and sailed as closely as possible, so that when morning broke she should have recovered the leeway she had made, and should be to windward of the vessel she was pursuing no matter how much astern.